In your books, people endure a lot of tragedies and the setbacks. They lose dragons, they lose their lives. I mean, in the new book, there's even one guy who loses the battle and they dip his skull in gold and use it as a drinking cup. So people go through a lot. And I'm wondering, what's the greatest setback you've faced in your career? I'm sure nothing as bad as that, as a drinking cup thing. But I'm just wondering, what's the greatest setback you've faced in your professional or personal career?
Yes, I've never been murdered or killed or tortured or locked away for 50 years. So I'm much better than a medieval traitor. For a writer in the 20th century, the worlds of science fiction and fantasy, I suppose the greatest setback I ever faced was the failure of my fourth novel, The Armageddon Rag. I mean, I started publishing in 1971. My first novel came out in 1977. I was a hot young writer for quite a long time, being nominated for Hugos and Nebulas. Each novel that I wrote got a bigger advance and more publicity and more awards nominations than the one before. And until I wrote The Armageddon Rag, and that seemed par for the course. It got me the biggest advance I'd gotten to date. It got great reviews. It was nominated for the World Fantasy Award. My publishers were certain it would be my first bestseller, and nobody bought it. And I discovered that, if you keep rolling the dice, sooner or later they come up boxcars. I still love The Armageddon Rag. I'm proud of it. I think it's a good novel. It certainly was well reviewed and well respected in its time, but for whatever reason, it was a commercial failure. And suddenly I found I could not sell my fifth novel. Suddenly I found no one wanted my books anymore. Because you're only as hot as your last success. You have a few flops in either books or television, and you can find your career is over. So oddly enough, the very book that ended my career as a novelist opened my career in Hollywood, because it was optioned for film, and the guy who optioned it for film, he never got it made as a film, but he was the same guy who CBS picked to revive The Twilight Zone. And when he did that, he called me up and said, hey, you want to write a Twilight Zone script for us? So suddenly I found myself being a television writer, and that basically saved me, because, there was a period there when I was unable to sell that fifth novel, where I was looking at having to sell my house, and I took one of those courses in buying real estate for no money down, in my desperation of, oh my God, how am I going to make any money here? There may be some aspiring writers in the audience here, some people who've dreamed of writing. Let me tell you, it's not a job for anyone who wants security. If you want security, there's lots of nice careers that one can have where one starts at the bottom and climbs the rung, and ultimately there's a pension and a gold watch at the end of it. Writer is not one of those jobs. It's a constant rolling of the dice, and you can have great success, and suddenly it can all blow away. And that's what happened to me with The Armageddon Rag.
Now, I was at a book festival recently, and the author of The Remains of the Day made the point that he thought that writers do their best work and they peak in their 30s and 40s. He's close to 60 years old now. I'm wondering, what do you think of that theory, and how do you think aging affects novelists? Does it improve their craft because they know more about the world, or are the people really better when they're younger? What do you think?
I think it's really an individual thing. There is something to what he says. I know the fields of science fiction and fantasy best, and you can look at some writers in that field and see that, yes, indeed, they did do their best work when they were in their 30s and 40s, or sometimes even their 20s. Some of them then, at a certain point, get writer's block or something, where they suddenly seize up. You have a writer like Theodore Sturgeon, immensely prolific for the early part of his career. He hits like the 60s, and he spends the last 20 years of his life working on allegedly one novel, and then he dies, and the novel finally comes out. You say, he took 20 years with this. It's like, and then you see other writers who continue to be prolific, but it's like they're rewriting the same novel all over again. this one is just like the last one, which was just like the one before that, which was just like the one before that. So it's like they're the old dog, but they don't know any new tricks. However, there are also some amazing exceptions. Jack Vance, one of my favorite writers, continued to write terrific books well into his 90s. Nigel Tranter, the Scottish historical novelist, again, continued to work right up until his mid-90s, writing the same kind of books he had written when he was in his 20s. So it all really depends on the writer. And there are writers who don't even start till they're late. I mean, R.A. Lafferty, a wonderful writer of science fiction short stories, spent his entire life as an electrician, and it's only when he retired at the age of 65 and started collecting Social Security that he started to write. And he had a whole second career as a very weird, unique, but fascinating science fiction writer, you know, from the ages of about 65 to 80. So it all depends on the writer.
Now, I just want to ask one or two questions from our Twitter followers from NWSA Plus. People have sent in their questions. And one question someone had is, where did you first come up with the ideas for these books? This is Shane at What the Heck Man. So he asked, I love when I have to read the actual Twitter handles. Where did he first come up with the idea for these books? Does he keep tweaking as it goes on, or is every character's fate already determined?
The main characters, I know where I'm going with them, but there are a million secondary characters, and for those, you know, I do have different ideas at different points. That's an impossible question, is the question of where do you get your ideas? Because ideas, like I say, are all around. You know, you just have an idea. You don't know where it comes from. I'm not. There are a few cases where I specifically know where an idea came from. I read something, or I saw something, or I had an experience that triggered an idea. But those are very few. Mostly it's just, oh, that would be interesting. Well, where did it come from? I didn't have it a moment ago, and now I had it. It popped up in my brain.
Well, can you focus a bit then? Because, I mean, C.S. Lewis wrote that when he came up with the Chronicles of Narnia, he came up with the images first. The image of a fawn holding an umbrella, an image of a queen on a sledge. And I know you came up with the first chapter of the book first of a boy heading for a beheading.
Right.
Was there an image or an event or something that sparked that first chapter that set you on the path to creating this whole world?
Not that I know of, but certainly it came from somewhere, but it just came vividly, and there it was. And I had the whole chapter in my head, not just, you know, Bran and the beheading, but also the finding of the direwolf pups in the summer snows. I knew that. I knew it had to be the summer snows. That phrase, in the summer snows, with the contradiction that it implies, tells you so much about the world, was just there. And I sat down and wrote it, put aside the other book I was doing, and did that.